So I would like to welcome all of you to the second of our bi-monthly series of talks on building the future, which is sponsored by the Baha'i community of Victoria. And bi-monthly, I think it is every 2 months. I never know if it is like twice a month or every 2 months, but it's every 2 months. And if you would like to know more about our future, some of the future talks, you can go, if you Google Victoria Baha'i Community, it will take you to the website, which has all of the talks and the topics on there, so you can have a preview of what's coming down the road. But tonight it gives me great delight and great pleasure to introduce our evening's speaker. Adrienne Carter is going to be speaking on the theme of spirituality and our search for meaning. Adrienne is a psychotherapist who's worked in the field of mental health for 30 years, the past 30 years. She obtained her master's degree in social work from McGill University and has worked in various places throughout Canada and overseas with populations who are traumatized because of war and natural disasters. Adrienne has recently returned from Jordan, where she worked for the past 2.5 years with the Center for Victims of Torture as a psychotherapist and a trainer. She's had the opportunity to work in many, many parts of the world with traumatized people of all races, ethnic backgrounds, and religious groups. Currently, she's part of a group that's setting up a mental health project in the Gaza Strip, and also here in Victoria with a group to provide trauma counseling for the refugee and immigrant population who come to Victoria to find a new life. And of course, refugees are on all of our minds lately. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Adrienne Carter.
Thank you, Valerie, for the introduction. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you here. It's delightful to see the room full. Can you let me know if you're not able to hear me well? Because I might forget about my voice as we go deeper into the topic. Now, spirituality and mental health is a huge topic. I was given 45 minutes max to talk about them. So we are just going to touch the surface. Previously, I have had the opportunity to give a whole day training, twice actually, on the issue of spirituality and mental health. The first time, it was in Jordan, where a Syrian medical group asked me to give a training because they were noticing that a lot of their patients, who were all also Syrian, were having a very difficult time in their spirituality. Many of them were experiencing a spiritual crisis. And the training was given, and then at a later time, I was giving a very similar training to the Jordanian therapists that we have worked with. Now, what was so exciting about the training for the Jordanian therapists, that they included, the majority were Muslim therapists, and there were also Christian therapists, and it was a wonderful discussion, maybe for the first time, about how we are all spiritually connected, and also how our traumatized clients are experiencing a lot of spiritual issues and mental health issues. So this has helped the Jordanian therapists to be able to even bring up the topic of spirituality. Because as psychologists, and several of you here I know are counselors and psychologists, it is sometimes difficult for us in the Western world to really delve deeply into the issue of spirituality. It's often not considered that scientific. So many times the mental health needs of our clients are explored, but somehow we often don't ask about their spiritual issues. And yet, what is so important to notice, that it all fits together. If there is trauma, mental health is very much affected, but also our spiritual health is very much affected. And I also wanted to say that this is not just with particular religious groups. I worked overseas mostly with Muslim groups, and it was definitely very evident with Muslim groups. But it was the same thing with, for example, with Hindus. When I worked in India during the tsunami, the spiritual issues became very important with our Hindu clients. Many of them were saying that this must be a scourge from God. We must have done something wrong. We are being punished. And then often I worked with Christian groups. For example, it was interesting because in a small town in Nigeria, there were Christians and Muslims living side by side for many years. For whatever reason, the entire town was destroyed. Christians attacked Muslims, Muslims attacked Christians. The town became a rubble. And when we went in to talk to the people who all became displaced, we heard exactly the same things from both groups. Why is this happening? All we want is peace. And so spiritually, both Christian and Muslim groups were equally affected. And we were shown the mass graves of the Muslim groups behind the mosque, the Christian groups behind the church. So what I have learned is that every religion, people coming from any religious group are very much affected when there is trauma. So looking at the questions that we have most often heard, why does God allow so much suffering? Where is God? Why me, God? Why would a good God allow his people to suffer? Etc., etc. And it doesn't matter whether the people were black or white, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, wherever they came from, it's the same questions that we were faced with. So, what is trauma? I think most of us throughout our lives have experienced trauma in one way or another. It is very difficult to grow up in this world without having faced some trauma. For some people, trauma became extremely intense. For others, it may have been a somewhat milder trauma, but how we respond to it is what is very important. So to call something a traumatic experience, you never experienced it before, it's overwhelming, and no matter who you are or where you are, that kind of trauma is overwhelming. It changes your life completely. It involves death or serious threat to one's life, and it is universally distressing. So that's the kind of trauma we're talking about, and that's the kind of trauma that I have had the opportunity to work with overseas in many different places. So at one point, I think in 2004, I was working in southern India when the tsunami hit. Everything in the path of the tsunami was destroyed. That's trauma. That's very definitely trauma. Then it was the earthquake in Pakistan. Again, very interesting to see, being in the midst of the earthquake in Pakistan, and there were Muslim population, versus the earthquake in Haiti, Christian population, yet the way they reacted to it was almost identical. And then wars. These are some pictures from Syria, and the Syrians and the Iraqis were our clients in Jordan. They have experienced intense trauma in Syria, and even when they came to Jordan, into refugee camps, there was no sense of safety for them. So it's trauma years through. And many of the children, like you see this little girl who was shot, she has never known peace because the war in Syria broke out about 4 years ago. And so many of the children have never experienced peace. And then what you might be in Canada more familiar is incest, rape, battering, and car accidents. But the way we react to these traumatic events is usually a very similar way that people all over the world react. Except sometimes here, at this time, it's a little bit easier maybe to share with a counselor if one has been raped or if one has experienced sexual abuse. These are still very difficult for people in the Middle East, for example, to talk about. But it affects them in a very similar way. So most of the clients that have been so traumatized ended up with many symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Is this a term familiar to many of you? It has nightmares, anxiety, re-experiencing the trauma, having a lot of intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, irritability. So it is extremely difficult to live with post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of the soldiers, for example, who returned back from Iraq or Korea or Vietnam has suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, and as we know, they have often turned to alcohol, drugs in order to dull the pain that this causes, and their families have often broke apart. So it's a constant struggle unless we can provide some assistance in order to reintegrate our mind and our bodies. And people with PTSD symptoms have a lot of difficulty falling asleep. They are irritable, they have outbursts of anger, difficulty concentrating, and are hypervigilant. So many of the children, when they try to go to school, they have a really difficult time paying attention. They fidget, they can't remember, and not just the children, the adults have the same problem too. One of the things, as I am working with the counselors in the Gaza Strip, one of the things that they are reporting is the anger in the whole area, the anger and aggressiveness of the children. I mean, these are some of the side effects when you're surrounded by war and destruction all of the time. So what is the psychological effect of trauma? First of all, in most cases, it's a shattering of innocence. When you see some of these things happening, and The closest one right now to us was what happened in Paris. It's horrifying even to watch it. And so the questions we ask, why them? How could people be so cruel? What is the whole meaning of evil? And people become completely disillusioned. And also, it's a loss of faith that there is any sense of safety or predictability or meaning in the world. I mean, right now here we feel everything is relatively safe. We can predict that tomorrow morning we're going to get up, we're going to do the activities we planned during the day. And what happens if something huge happens? It could be an earthquake, it could be an explosion. All of these things that we felt we can count on, we can no longer count on. So we really start questioning, can we trust anybody? And that, by the way, is one of the side effects of trauma, that you lose your trust in people. You don't even want to talk to people, often not even to your members of your family, because you don't know who you can trust. And this was very evident having worked with Syrian clients, because there were so many groups in Syria that were fighting with each other, and sometimes in families, one brother went with one group, another brother went with another group. So who do you trust? These were sometimes, very often, the questions. And the trauma takes on a life of its own. If it's not integrated into our minds and our bodies, it starts to control us, instead of us being able to control our feelings. And in order to cope with it, many people experience a great numbness of the body. We very often hear this, that they're not able to feel. Because if you numb your body, you don't feel the pain so much. But you also do not feel and experience the joy. And when people turn to alcohol or drugs, it's a way to numb their body so that they would not feel the pain so much. So how do we understand these things as to what's happening? Doesn't matter what our spiritual beliefs are, we each believe in something that helps us to understand what's going on. Many people start believing that God is uncaring, or conversely, that this is the will of God. And whatever we believe, it doesn't seem to be sufficient to really completely explain what's happening. Many people felt that this is God's will and it must be accepted. Now, interestingly, the people who could still hold on to a divine power seem to have gotten better a little bit faster than people who lost that ability to believe. And those are the people that have experienced a real strong spiritual crisis. Some people thought that it's an angry and punitive God that is trying to punish them. And this is what I noticed in India, that they mentioned that it had been written up thousands of years ago, that this is going to be happening, and they are being punished for some kind of sin. Nobody knew what kind of sin. And then many people felt a real guilt for staying alive. Why my family have been killed and I am still here. And that guilt was so very strong that until we were able to cope with that guilt and help the person to work through the guilt, they didn't get better. For example, I remember one of the Syrian men who came to us, and he and his daughter were together in a certain city in Syria. She was getting married, they were getting the marriage license, and while this was happening, the daughter was caught by the Syrian army and killed, shot right in front of the father. And the father froze. He couldn't move. He was standing on the other side of the street, and he was unable to move to get to the daughter. And the daughter died and was taken away, and he didn't even know where he was taken away. We saw this man more than a year after this incident has happened, and he was still completely frozen. In fact, he didn't even have the capacity to share what happened with his wife, who was at home. So it was a lot of work to try and help him to understand that when trauma hits us, none of us know how we are going to behave. We think we may behave in a certain way. We think we may either fight back or run away. We don't usually think that we may just freeze. So it has nothing to do with how strong we are. Our reptilian brain takes over, and these things happen. And so the big issue is, how do we help the people heal? Because that's what needs to happen. So human-made disasters, how people are capable of such evil, like what happened in Paris. When we see the pictures of people being decapitated, how could anybody do this? It's totally beyond our understanding. And we often think, did God abandon us? Or was God unwilling to protect us? So, what is spirituality? Are you still following me? Any thoughts, questions? Okay? We will have some time for questions after this. So, spirituality is usually a belief and obedience to an all-powerful force, but not always. It's a way that people find a purpose to their lives, find meaning in their life, and it connects us to each other. And this universality extends to everybody, to people in different countries, different races, different religions. And also the qualities of love, honesty, patience, tolerance, compassion. Spirituality develops these qualities in us. Right now, spirituality is even actually more linked to humanism and the positive psychology that doesn't necessarily have religion and the sacred as part of it. And religion is institutionalized spirituality. So each religion has different sets of beliefs, traditions, doctrines. They have different ways of worshiping. And what is interesting is religion is actually a vehicle that gets us to spirituality. And sometimes it is a really good vehicle because it develops in us compassion, gratitude, love, joy, and all these qualities. But sometimes instead of being a bridge to spirituality, we get stuck on the bridge. And this is what happens when religions feel that they are the only right ones, the other religions are not okay, do not speak to them, do not interact with them because you're the only one that has the truth. And right now what we are observing in some aspects of Islam, and this is just some aspects of Islam, is they stuck on that bridge and cannot connect with spirituality. But then, having worked with so many Muslim people, this is not the general way that they think, because they too want to connect with the world. So it's very sad what is happening with ISIS and with some other areas. So how is post-traumatic stress disorder and spirituality are connected? As we mentioned before, PTSD has symptoms that are very difficult to abide. The intrusive thoughts, the images, and the memories may feel like it's a spiritual oppression. In fact, in some cultures, they say the bad spirits are striking you, and they have to get rid of the bad spirits. The nightmares may feel like punitive or condemning. God is punishing me for surviving. A sense of numbing may also be felt spiritually, because when you can't feel, you can't have that spiritual joy that normally we're experiencing. And when you cannot sleep and cannot concentrate, you use your spiritual practices such as meditating, praying, reading the holy writings becomes extremely difficult. So many people who were very deep in their spiritual life, when trauma hits, they find that their spirituality is distant. They're not able to do the things that they were doing before. And trauma also affects our relationship to our bodies. If we're constantly experiencing hyperarousal, you can't ever relax. You're always looking over your shoulder. Somebody may attack you. In order to survive this, many people cut their awareness to their bodies. And this leads to a dissociation from the body in order to try and defend themselves. And this has very strong implications for healing and for spirituality. Because if we cannot feel alive, if we cannot feel pleasure, sensation, and connection, it is very difficult to heal. So in order to heal, we need to re-own, reconnect with our bodies. Okay, so we spoke about the negative aspects of trauma on spirituality. But at the same time, many people experience positive aspects. And maybe the positive aspects are not immediate, but it will be realized later. It can cause immense spiritual awakening and growth. And we all know that some of the most inspirational spiritual leaders led lives that were characterized by profound suffering. For example, we're all acquainted with the life of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha, and having been in prison for 40 years, and were exposed to so much suffering. And there are many other spiritual leaders. Gandhi was also one of these people. Their suffering has deepened them. It deepened their faith. And our souls can open up and expand. So these are some of the really positive aspects of trauma. Now here is a very interesting way, and I'm sure that this is not new to any of us, how the mind, body, and the spirit are interconnected. The physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So when trauma hits us, it hits all the aspects. And if you're mentally not well, then it will affect your spiritual aspects, and it also affects your physical aspects. So many of the illnesses that we suffer are very strongly connected to how we feel emotionally. And many ways that we feel, for example, anger, jealousy, and all these qualities will affect and influence our body. And unless we can do something about that, it will be very difficult for us to heal. But healing is not at all impossible, because once we start working on these qualities, we can change ourselves. Those of you who might be familiar with the writings of Peter Levine, who is a somatic experience therapist, he's a psychologist, and he made some very interesting observations. Here the antelope is being chased by the lion, and this happens in the jungle all the time. If the antelope survives and doesn't get killed by the lion, what happens with the antelope is they begin to shake, just shake. Shake out all of the trauma that happened to their bodies. And they forget about the trauma. They don't get PTSD, which is really very, very interesting. Because what happens in our bodies when we are traumatized, we have a real need to shake. I don't know if you've seen anybody right after an accident or after a trauma. The body wants to shake. But because this is so poorly understood, often the doctors or the ambulance stops you from shaking. And they give you something so that you stop shaking. And yet it's very often this shaking that gets rid of all the traumatic energy. And it prevents you from getting PTSD. And even during therapy, it's interesting to see, because most of the therapeutic sessions, whether we do body therapy or talking therapy, your body starts to shake. And it will be one way to get rid of the traumatic energy. So this is what we were talking about. How do we discharge the frozen residue of energy? And it's moving in and out of the freezing state. So when people come to us where their bodies are completely numb, we start working with them in a very careful way. So they discharge some energy, and then we stop. Then we titrate the discharge. And eventually they are able to start discharging the energy that has been frozen in their bodies, often for years. And they do get better. And if we don't provide some help to people who have experienced trauma, Oh, already? All right. So, sorry. One of the things that is interesting to see when we get heart disease or have low back pains or even cancer, it's very often connected to some unresolved issues in our lives. So people with heart disease often had experiences that blocks out intimacy or love from their lives. Low back pain has often been associated with financial worries. Cancer often have unresolved connections with the past. And one of the things we have found is that people, even when they did get cancer and heart disease, if they managed to start working through these unresolved issues, they very often did get better. So it's so important to be in touch with our bodies as well as with our minds. Oh, I have less than 10 minutes, but some of the challenges to our spirituality would be cynicism, anger, revenge, feelings of isolation. And these are often the qualities that people who have been traumatized are feeling. So if we can start working through these feelings, then they will get better. And many times they become suicidal because they lost all meaning in their lives. And there is nothing to live for. And their religious and spiritual beliefs have shattered. So that's when they no longer want to live. And it was very difficult at first to get our Muslim clients to share their suicidal thoughts because it's not acceptable in Islam. But we were very surprised to hear how many people no longer wanted to live. But after even a few sessions of therapy, they were able to reverse that feeling. And where we struggle to work with them is how do you achieve meaning again in your life? Because they had meaning before. They knew what they wanted to do. They had a good path that they followed. And it's all turned around. So now they needed to achieve a new meaning. Jealousy and rage. I'm going to go really fast. How many more minutes do I have? 5. 10 more. 10 more minutes, okay. And war is often institutionalized anger. And you can see that. You can see what happened in Paris, for example, where there was so much murderous pent-up rage. And what causes so much rage? Wars can cause that. Children who grow up in wars and don't know anything else, they become very angry children. They don't feel welcomed by anybody. Many of the teenage boys have left their families in Jordan and they wanted to go back to Syria to fight, even though they knew that they're not likely to come out of it alive. So when Abdu'l-Baha says, "Come and cast down your weapons of wrath till unity is won, come and in the Lord's true path, each one help each one." If we can reach out to people who have been hurt, wounded, and traumatized, to my way of seeing, it's the only way we can achieve peace. And he also says, when a thought of war comes, opposed by a stronger thought of peace, a thought of hatred must be destroyed by a more powerful thought of love. Thoughts of war bring destruction to all, harmony. well-being, restfulness, and content. Thoughts of love are constructive of brotherhood, peace, friendship, and happiness. So what's happening now when, after the Paris attacks, we hear everybody's filled with fear? What happens if we allow the Syrian refugees to come? Could these things happen in our country? And fear is beginning to rule us. But on the other hand, if we follow some of these beautiful statements, if we can reach out and welcome people and treat them as human beings, this is very unlikely to happen. So there is a lot here that we're not going to be able to talk about, but everybody all over the world responds to kindness, responds to love, to connection. And it's really important that we can show the desire to connect and our caring to the refugees that Canada wants to take in, instead of being ruled by fear, because that's unfortunately what is happening right now. And just one more statement, and this is by an old Cherokee told his grandson. My son, there is a battle between two wolves inside us all. One is evil. It is anger, jealousy, greed, resentment, inferiority, lies, and ego. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, humility, kindness, empathy, and truth. The boy thought about it and asked, Grandfather, which wolf wins? The old man quietly replied, the one you feed. And this is very powerful, because if we feed our anger, our jealousy, our greed, we become destroyed by it. If we feed our positive qualities, then that's really the way to heal. I'm going to stop right here. There is still quite a bit to cover, but take a little bit more time. Are you okay with just a little bit further? Okay.
Pick your favorite parts.
Pick my favorite parts. Oh, wow. There is this beautiful statement from Nelson Mandela. As I walked out the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. And when that man came out, we all wondered, how come he was trying to connect with everybody, the people who have harmed him, the people who have imprisoned him, but he had the capacity to put his hatred and bitterness behind. And so that's the way we grow. That's the way our soul grows. These are big parts. The dark night of the soul is also a very interesting part, because most of us at one time or another in our lives experience the dark night of the soul. And when a trauma hits us, we are catapulted into this dark night of the soul. Because everything that we know has turned upside down. There is no path to follow. And it is then becomes our job to find a new path and a new way of living. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist and philosopher, and I have learned a great deal from him. He has been put in the Nazi concentration camps in 1942, and through his spiritual strength and will to life, he survived. And after he has come out of the camps, he was the originator of logotherapy. And this is an approach where he found that if you can create a meaning in your life, you will heal, you will be okay. And many people here in our midst, people who are struggling with depression, for example, they seem to have lost the meaning in their lives. And usually there is a trauma. If we go back a little bit further, there is a trauma that has taken place, but the trauma wasn't integrated. The trauma wasn't worked through. And when that happens, our whole life can be spent struggling with our demons instead of healing. So this is why it is so very important that if a traumatic incident happened, that we find a way to get some help and work through it, because that's the only way to heal. So I'm going to end it here, and I wonder if you had any thoughts, any questions, comments?
I do. Could you tell Stephen Levine, I read book Waking the Tiger.
Oh yes, Waking the Tiger, Peter Levine, yes.
Did you study with him at all, or was...
Oh, I wish. I have seen some wonderful videos of his work, and we have trained our counselors in some of the model that Stephen Levine has. He has such an elegant body model of how to work with people who have been traumatized. So he's very well known in the field of somatic experiencing, yes.
Do you incorporate some of that yourself?
Yes, yes. The whole energy work, there are people who specialize in energy therapy, because what happens in trauma, the energy no longer flows smoothly through your body. You are blocked, and you can be blocked in certain parts of your body. And then it's those parts of the body that becomes sick. And once you can get the energy flow smoothly, it's a way to heal. You had a...
Adrienne, you've spoken, well, first of all, let me thank you for your work. Sounds like it's been a lifelong journey for you, and I salute you for it. A number of the points that you made about those that have been afflicted by trauma have questioned the whole thing around causation. Where did it come from? And it challenged their spirituality. But I'm wondering about the whole question of causation, because so much of it gets blurry. Where did this war begin? When it's been, maybe it's generational, or
Yes.
And many things like that. It gets murky, and right now we're having a national debate that is touches on the whole thing of causation in a profound way, and the factual record often goes by the wayside. And I'm just wondering about whether or not causation can be addressed in a way that deals with it both politically and spiritually.
Well, it's a very good question that you're asking, because it's often very difficult to explain how things happen. But what seems to be the most important is what the particular person believes is happening. For example, an earthquake isn't something that God wanted us to go through. There is scientific explanation. But if the person believes that the earthquake was caused by God, in some ways it can help because he can say it's God's will, and we need to accept God's will. Or he could say, I no longer believe in a God that can cause so much pain in the world. So I have not been able to find a really terrific explanation, but it's what the person believes and whether they can hold on to that divine power or whether they just let it go and they no longer believe in anything. And many of the Iraqi and Syrian clients that I had a chance to work with just let it go. They felt that they could no longer believe in a God that allows this to happen. Now, this shattering of the spiritual belief they're very fragile at that point. So we do not accept the fact that they will never believe again. In fact, I feel very strongly that our job is very gently assist them to regain some of their spiritual belief. And they do. And even when they are suicidal and no longer want to live, we found that with a gentle kind of therapy and especially connectedness with a person who cares, they start slowly to develop a different meaning in their lives. And they don't want to let their lives go. Which is interesting because very often they come in and not only suicidal thoughts, but sometimes mothers say, and fathers too, I can't live in this world anymore and I don't want my family to have to experience so much hardship. And they talk about maybe killing their children. Now, it hasn't happened, but once they can express this, then we can start providing the supports they need. And the biggest support we can provide is a connection to us, to another human being. We can use many different modalities that may or may not work, but the modality that is most powerful is the connection with us. And we don't have to speak even the same language that they're doing, but wow, those connections are very powerful and it can give them back a meaning of life. Somebody cares. So I don't know whether this answers your question, but...
Well, it does in a way. What I think you're saying to me that I'm hearing is not to get caught up in, like I've been to Israel and Ireland and Latin American conflict zones, and I get caught up in the history of causation. And the moment you begin to go there, you end up justifying different sides to different degrees. You're weighing things, and all of that just gets, depending on what you believe is a fact and truth, determines so much of what then follows. But if you want to keep that spiritual center, you've got to let go of that, because there's no way of actually resolving. History is often written by the victor, and you're just not going to, unless you're a historian, you really have a difficulty justifying either side in a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're telling me is to you said quite a bit there, and I think it's like living in the moment,
Yes.
and the only way you let go of conflict is stopping conflict.
Yes. And reason often doesn't come into this. So you're looking at it from a reasonable point of view as to what really happened and who might be right. But when a person is traumatized, they cannot think reasonably. And so we got to meet them just where they are.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people here are likely to go and be helpers for these people on other places in the planet, but we do have people in our own communities that are traumatized for different reasons.
Yes.
And we come across them all the time. Is there anything that you can suggest, like the constant, continual, or a connection with somebody who cares, show you care, is what I got. Is there like a type of therapy or
There is many
books
types.
or understanding that you can do to help whoever you come across? Could be somebody on the street.
You know, you are so right, because right in our cities, there are so many people who really need help. And unfortunately, mental health hasn't been very well recognized in our country, in our province, but this is the same thing all over. Children have a little better chance of getting therapy, but even for children, it takes a long time in order to get in. There's long wait lists. But for adults, they very often go to a psychiatrist, they get medication, and come back once a month, but therapy is often not provided. And one of the things we found that people who are severely traumatized and we worked with, they do the healing process, mostly 95% of them do it without medication. And when they quickly get some antidepressants, which cause all kinds of side effects, and they're not used to antidepressants, they often stop taking it and they don't get better. So the ideal thing is for doctors and mental health therapists to be able to work closely together and jointly decide what is the best plan for the person. And you're very right in what you say. Many people are not getting what they need.
They will never get to a therapist. Many people will never. So that's why I was thinking, what can the average Joe do to learn, like global therapy or something, to
Well,
help people in their own way as you pass down the street? And like, I just was wondering.
Being able to connect with people, showing people that you care about what happens to them, trying to make sure that they have food to eat and a place to stay. These are very, very powerful things. Yes, you're not using any kind of fancy therapies, but you care, and you are able to provide some ongoing support. And maybe sometimes taking the person to try and get therapy. We didn't think that the Syrian people, for example, would be amenable to therapy because it wasn't known at all in their countries. And once we opened our doors, initially a few came. They got better. Then they wanted, their neighbors wanted to come, their family members wanted to come. Then they brought their children. And we had hundreds and hundreds of clients. We couldn't do it fast enough. So even people who say, I don't believe in therapy, I don't believe in talking, you should have heard those people sharing their trauma. When grown men were crying about what has happened, like those therapy groups that we have had, were so powerful. And they did get better. We had some very good research going as to what our therapists were able to assist them, and it's been proven that they did get better.
Sort of like release sessions.
Oh yeah. Well, you've got to release it, because if you keep it inside your body, whatever has happened, it's very difficult to get better. Once you start talking, once you release the energy and your body starts to feel, that's the way to healing.
Thank you.
And I wish we could offer a great deal more here too.
Me too.
Yeah, you're right.
And maybe we will in the future.
I am really hoping, yes.
So I would think we should all give our speaker a tremendous round of applause.